Well, good morning and good afternoon, attendees. We're excited to have you with us today to discuss the PFAS regulatory status regarding the TSCA Substance Control Act. My name is Mary Rosenberski. I'm with Collins Aerospace, a division of RTX, and I will serve as your monitor today. This event is being recorded and will be available post-webinar on the IAEG YouTube channel for further reference. Thank you for joining. Next slide, please. So for those of you that may not be familiar with IAEG, the International Aerospace Environmental Group, this is a nonprofit organization of global aerospace companies really created to collaborate on and share innovative environmental solutions for the industry. The work groups promote the development of voluntary consensus standards and provide accessible solutions for key environmental issues. Now, certainly members of IAEG and those of you on the call today are currently aware of a wide variety of different laws and regulation impacting the health, environment, and certainly the complexity to our supply chain. The various work groups create a forum for diverse and alternate technologies, ESG matters, including greenhouse gases and reporting. And this webinar is being supported by IAEG Work Group 9, and our primary function is alerts, fact sheets, review of pending regulations, and webinars. Next slide, please. So let's just hit on a few of the key compliance reminders. It's very important to recognize that work is in compliance with IAEG governance requirements and policies, including the antitrust compliance policy and the conflicts of interest policy, right? So many of us working in the aerospace industry are familiar with some of these, but if a conflict of interest arises within this webinar, within an IAEG meeting, we must report this and disclose of it right away. We would want to have no conversation or exchanges in regards to prices or pricing or other restraints on competitions of any kind, right? And it's important to also recognize that we don't want to have any activities that may not include prices, pricing methods, or even named suppliers in any of our specific business transactions, right? This webinar and our projects are designed to avoid adherence or impacts on competition. Certainly, we all take training on not to disclose export control data or proprietary information of any kind. And certainly when we're in this collaborative environment, we would not want to share any personal data about individuals participating in IAEG or on this call today that are in compliance with our privacy policy. And please be thoughtful that these conversations can also be informal, so make sure that you apply these practices to these informal conversations as well. So thank you for keeping these key points in mind today. Next slide, please. All right, now we'll take a moment to introduce some of our knowledgeable panelists that will be reviewing the agenda items with you today. First, we have Lisa Brown. She's a Lockheed Martin Fellow working in environmental safety and health and sustainability. Lisa is the lead for IAEG Work Group 9 for chemical and environmental regulations. She's also her corporation's U.S. chemical compliance lead, specializing in the Toxic Substance Control Act known as TSCA. And she's the lead for her corporation's ISO 19001 and 45001 certification program. Next, we have Callie Edgren. She's the Vice President of Regulatory and Sustainability at Ascent, a SaaS provider that helps with manufacturers engage with their supply chain, along with a number of sustainability topics. Callie leads a team of experts who engage with manufacturers and industry groups to influence and communicate regulatory obligations in the global market. Next, we have Christine Poulsen. She's the TSCA Product and Safety Regulatory Affairs Manager at Henkel. She works closely with internal stakeholders and external partners, such as trade associations, to coordinate and manage Henkel's strategic response to TSCA regulations and reporting requirements. Next, I'd like to introduce Tiffany Thomas. She's the principal consultant working on emerging contaminants leaders at Haley and Aldrich. Dr. Tiffany Thomas specializes in a wide range of chemical chemistries, including PFAS, which our webinar will focus on today. And then finally, you have myself. I'm a general manager at Collins Aerospace, a division of RTX. I currently work in the Global Chemical Substance Program Office. My areas of expertise are in operations, digital technology projects, and a data analyst. So these will be your speakers for today. We look forward to sharing our knowledge with you. And then I believe I have one more slide, please. So for our webinar today, our panelist, Tiffany, she'll talk about applicability. She's with Haley and Aldrich again. Reporting requirements will be covered by Lisa Brown from Lockheed Martin. Reporting obligations from Callie at Ascent. And then risks and liabilities with Christine Poulsen at Henkel. And we'll take questions and answers at the end. Certainly, you're welcome to post any questions in the chat, and the speakers will look to answer those as they can. And then we have some dedicated time at the end if there's allowable time for collaboration. And again, this event is being recorded and will be on the IAEG YouTube channel. Thank you very much, folks. We'll go ahead and kick it off to our first speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. Good morning, everyone. If you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, that would be great. So as was discussed, I will be talking about applicability with respect to the Section 8A7 reporting. So if you would go ahead and go on to the next slide. Now, I won't go down the deep rabbit hole of all things PFAS chemistry, but I would like to point out that the family tree of PFAS is quite large. It includes polymers and monomers, all sorts of different subcategories, all of which have the same general properties, right? The fluorinated carbon chain backbone that gives it its unique properties of water and oil resistance, and then the head group that is often proprietary and highly variable. The chemistry that's specific to the TSCA reporting requirements can fall anywhere within this family tree. So, it is not specific to any one particular category. Next slide. Okay. I think this was a little bit premature on the poll because we haven't quite gotten to this topic yet. But if anybody has this, knows this ahead of time, that would be great because, PFAS is, as everybody knows, quite ubiquitous. So as everyone fills in this polling, I want you to consider the fact that, we might consider some categories somewhat more obvious than others. I won't give you won't give away the answer here, but I think we have a timer going on how long this poll will run for. Is that about right? Wonderful. Okay. To those of you who answered all of the above, you are correct. So PFAS can be in any one of these categories. Firefighting foams is often the lowest hanging fruit, and paints and coatings certainly is part of that, but it is incorporated mist suppressants, wetting agents, sealants, cleaning agents, all sorts of other things. So thank you for responding. Looks like a good proportion of you were already aware of these things. If you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Wonderful. So as those of you who responded accordingly already know, there are an entire universe of uses of PFAS, hence why there is such a ubiquitous nature of it in both in the supply chain and the environment. The top half of this pie chart indicates the segments of the product uses that are more specific to the A&D industry, but again, there are other uses that are broader and are included in other industrial applications. So as I mentioned previously, mist suppressants, aviation hydraulic fluids, which was not part of the polling options, but that is a known and substantial use. Photographic and photolithography processes as well, I want to highlight there. It's also part of semiconductor manufacturing and circuit board printing. So for electronics purposes, I want to point that out as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned previously, although the chemical character of PFAS is quite broad, TSCA specifically references 3 structural requirements that are pertinent to this reporting. These 3 bullet line items here are the structural descriptions of what constitutes a reportable substance. There will be some later discussion of these structures in greater detail, so I will not beleaguer this point too much right now, but to say that this is a different description and a different definition than other regulatory language. So if you look at the scientific description, that is an incredibly broad definition, as is the state ban definition, which basically says a single carbon saturated with fluorines. That is very all-encompassing of the PFAS family tree. These structural definitions are more limiting than those others. And like I said, there will be additional details provided by later speakers. Next slide. Now, I want to differentiate here in the reporting applicability that there is a reporting, obviously, as those of you who reported through TSCA previously, that there is a differentiation between articles and non-articles. And so within the PFAS space, articles would still adhere to this definition. And so obviously, like a Teflon gasket or part would be defined as this article. A painted object would be also part of this definition of an article. But something like a fluid or particle is not an article. So if you are buying paints, if you're buying hydraulic fluids, paints in bulk, not applied, that would be not subject to this article exemption. And so for products that are part of this article exemption, it is the total volume that, the total weight that is important, part of the reporting, rather than a lot of the additional details that would be applicable to the non-article category reporting. Next slide. Now, these sources of this information, regardless if you're talking about articles or non-articles, but more specifically non-articles, will reside within multiple, will be within multiple hands. So corporate information obviously is quite straightforward relative to some of these other categories. Suppliers will be the primary source of information necessary for this reporting. The type of the name and or CAS number of the PFAS, and the form and mass within that particular article or material. We can extrapolate from that the structure and to some extent byproducts and environmental health, but to, for everybody's frame your expectations, that information is somewhat limited. I mean, there are roughly 15,000 total PFAS, about 1,500 or so is estimated, probably greater than that, to be subject to TSCA. Only several dozen really have a great amount of research dedicated to byproducts and environmental health. So just be forewarned, there may be a lot of unknowns in that technical data category. And then, of course, the facility data that would be pertinent to the non-article reporting as well. Next slide. As I mentioned, within that technical data space, there would be reasonable expectation that there would be information that would not be known or reasonably ascertainable. So to the extent that, again, suppliers would be the primary source of the information, again, the CAS identification or name of any particular PFAS, you could look internally and outreach to your suppliers, but it is not required to outreach to your suppliers. That will also be discussed later on. And more specifically, it does not require product testing to the extent that would be a limited ability anyway, because product testing would not be able to specifically identify the vast majority of PFAS that would be subject to this reporting. So this would all qualify under that not known or reasonably ascertainable distinction. Next slide. Wonderful. And with that, I will pass it on to our next speaker and welcome any questions as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiffany. And before I get started with my slides, we'll have another quick test for you. So the question is, what is the reporting period or the look back period for PFAS under the TSCA rule? Getting close. Okay, I'm about to end the poll in just a minute. Okay, so we'll share the results. So if you answered January 2011 through December 2022, you are correct. I don't have a prize for you, but a hand clap. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this TSCA PFAS reporting rule, it applies to manufacturers and or importers of chemical substances that contain per or polyfluoroalkyl substances or PFAS. And this applies for the look back period as seen in the test question, January 1st, 2011 to December 31st, 2022. That's your look back period. So who has to report on this? Again, if you're a manufacturer or a importer, you're required to report if you have a substance that contains PFAS during this look back period. And what you're required to report on is any chemical substances or mixtures containing a chemical substance. Now, this includes articles. That's a little bit different and a little bit more challenging, as we all know. So we're not just talking about formulations and mixtures. We're talking about our parts and our hardware as well. Those things that contain a PFAS is what you will need to report on to the Environmental Protection Agency. And the way that you will do the reporting is electronically through EPA's Central Data Exchange System. Now, I will say, if you have not registered or used CDX before, I implore you to go ahead and get used to CDX. There's a process that you have to go through to register to use this tool. So please do not wait until the last minute to do that. Go ahead and start getting set up in CDX. Most reporting would be required now by January 22nd, 2026. The tool is expected to now open up on July 11th, 2025. This is a recent change, as before the tool would have opened up in November of this year, and we would have been required to report out next year. But now the dates have changed, and the new reporting period, or the period of time that the tool will be open, is from July 11th, 2025 to January 22nd, 2026. So now we have a little bit more time to do our close examination of those things that we must report to the EPA. Tiffany has addressed the structural requirements in terms of reporting, but in terms of the regulation, we're typically used to reporting on our chemicals based on CAS numbers. However, this is a little different. EPA is requiring reporting based on a structural definition. And the requirement is that it must meet at least one of the 3 structures that's identified on the screen. This is what's covered under the rule. EPA has published 2 lists of PFAS that meet the definition that you see above. That's in the Comp Tox Chemicals Dashboard PFAS list and the SRS PFAS list. However, these lists are non-exhaustive, and you must just determine, it would be good for you to get a chemist involved perhaps to make sure that the products that you are manufacturing or importing does not meet any of the structural definitions that you see on the screen. Entities that have only processed, distributed in commerce, or used and or disposed of PFAS are not required to report under this rule unless they also have manufactured or imported PFAS. So very important. This rule only covers manufacturers and importers again. There is a provision also for small manufacturers where they are granting an additional 6-month period to report to the EPA. So if you meet the definition of a small manufacturer as it appears on this screen, then you have a little bit more time to report on this rule. Now, I do want to clarify, because I do see some questions coming up. When we're talking about manufacturing and importing, we're talking about manufacturing in the United States or importing of the products containing PFAS into the United States. So yes, this regulation applies to the US. However, many of our companies have a vast footprint and may have companies outside of the US and may be sending something over to the United States. So just because you're situated in another country does not necessarily mean it does not apply to you in the sense of information being needed to be shared to your counterparts in the United States. Also, when entering information to the CDX system, I'm almost positive that you have to be a US entity in order to enter information into the tool. Next slide, please. So what needs to be reported? We talked already about manufacturers and importers. We talked about the reporting period or the look back period. Now, the information that's required into the report is included in the regulation, but the way that you're going to enter it into the tool may be a little different because they use categories and codes within the central data exchange system. But basically, the information that will need to be reported includes your company and plant site information, chemical identifiers such as the common or the trade name of the PFAS and the CAS number, the categories in which you use and the concentration ranges for that chemical, the amount that you manufactured or imported, any byproduct reporting, environmental and health effects, worker exposure data, and disposal data. Now, there is a provision in the regulation that addresses streamlined reporting. And it's a little bit reduced reporting if you are importing articles only. And if it is streamlined reporting, then you would only need to report on the company and plant site information, the chemical specific information, the categories of use. And as you see here, you would not need to report on things like your byproduct reporting, environmental and health effects, work exposure data, or disposal data. You'll need to report on imported article production volume and any additional information requested by EPA in the rule. Now, I think someone Tiffany, I think you alluded to this already, but the regulation also talks about known to or reasonable ascertainable information. And Tiffany has already covered that in terms of you don't have that information readily available. They don't want you to go out and do any surveys or any additional testing to come up with the information. But I think that's a very valuable piece of information to have. And within the CDX tool, they will allow you to mark something as known to or reasonably ascertainable information as to whether it's not known or reasonably ascertainable. Next slide, please. And now we'll have our next speaker, Callie.
Hello, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit more about reporting and then some of the exceptions and special conditions around what data you need to report. Next slide, please. So previous presenters have discussed the EPA's forms a little bit. I will say this is one of the changes between the proposed rule from the EPA back in June of 2021 and the final rule in October of 2023 is that the EPA created some streamlined versions of the reporting forms. This is especially relevant to complex manufacturers whose largest exposure here is probably on those imported articles. I see a lot of questions on the side about imported articles, so that is probably very relevant to many of you here. There is a full version, but there is also a streamlined article importer version, and there is a streamlined option for those who are importing research and development substances below 10 kilograms. The EPA actually does have a website, and I can paste this in the chat when I'm done, where you can download a spreadsheet that will tell you the exact details reported for each of these three forms. Over on the right, I've just included the required fields for the article importer form. The full submission is much, much more detailed than this, but you can see the article importer form is quite streamlined. So make sure if you download that, once I share that link, that you're looking at the right tab based on what your situation is. But they did pull a lot of the details out that originally back in June of 2021, article importers were going to have to report, and you'll see it's been tapered down quite a bit. This data does go into the EPA's Central Data Exchange System. This is the same system that they use for the every 4-year CDR reporting. If you don't know what CDR reporting is, I would recommend you check with the EHS people in your facilities because they may be the ones who are already doing this CDR reporting. You may already have an account for your facility. As mentioned, the EPA has recently pushed back their dates for reporting by 8 months. So whereas the window was going to open on November 12th, this has now been pushed back to July 11th of 2025. And the reports will be due for most companies by January 22nd of 2026. As mentioned, there are some exemptions for small businesses who are allowed an additional 6 months to complete their reporting. I use the word exemption, meaning in regards to the date, not in regards to whether or not you have to report, because small businesses are not exempt from the reporting altogether. They're just provided a little bit more time. Of course, this may be a challenge for large manufacturers who rely on data from the small manufacturers to understand their products. So this is where that supplier engagement and relationship is going to be very important. Next slide, please. So a couple of special additions to this. Companies may claim some of the information as confidential business information, or CBI. You see specifically the chemical identifier itself such as the substance name, the CAS number, if they are not on the TSCA inventory already. So if you have a chemical and for some reason it's not on the public inventory, you could claim that as CBI, company identifier, product volume and amount. These are listed very specifically in the regulation itself. You have to make this confidentiality claim at the time the information is submitted, and you will have to, have that substantiated. I do want to point out that this CBI process is the primary reason that the EPA gives for the delay, the 8-month delay, is that they have not had the funding yet to reconfigure the CDX system to make this CBI process work with the data submissions. But this is going to be allowed. There are some exceptions. I don't list them all here. Again, they're listed clearly in the regulation itself. But some data cannot be considered to be CBI. That includes the chemical identifiers for PFAS that are on the TSCA inventory. So if it's already listed on the inventory, you can't claim that that's confidential business information. Some generic chemical names, LVE numbers, or accession numbers. If you put something down there as not known or reasonably ascertainable, which we're going to hear a little bit more about, you can't claim that that's CBI. So there are some exceptions, and again, there are more exceptions than I've listed here. The other caveat here is that if you have claimed CBI in the CDR system before for other TSCA reporting obligations, you cannot assume that that CBI coverage is going to carry forward to this particular rule. You will have to reassert that CBI claim and resubstantiate that again for this particular rule. So CBI in the past does not equal CBI for PFAS reporting. Next slide, please. We've again had a lot of questions about article importers. Article importers are able to use the streamlined article importer form. As I mentioned, article importers cannot use the CBI process. Again, there is a lot less information required for the article importers. And as such, the EPA doesn't feel that it's necessary for article importers to assert the CBI claims. But again, for all others who do want to assert that CBI claim, you will have to do that separately for this rule and substantiate it. Next slide, please. So a couple of other considerations here. One is duplicative reporting. So there were a lot of comments the EPA received after the June 2021 draft around duplicative reporting, duplicative information. We should not have to submit this again. The EPA has slightly conceded that point. However, they point out that information that you may have submitted through the CDR system, the greenhouse gas reporting system, the toxic release inventory or TRI, or other TSCA sections may not have all of the same requirements as this particular reporting. So that could limit what is duplicative. So you may be able to claim that for some of the data fields, but not necessarily for all of the data fields. So you need to be really careful that you don't just wipe away your obligations altogether saying, oh, we've already submitted that in the past. You need to check the actual data fields that you're submitting. The EPA is actually not very concerned about getting information twice. They even give an example of if you import something, export it, and then re-import it. Maybe it's been assembled into something else and you're re-importing it again, let's say a wire harness. They have no problem with that same wire harness being reported twice. Once on the first import and again on the second import once it's maybe been incorporated into something else. So they don't seem to be overly concerned about duplicative reporting. I think they would rather get that information than not. Joint submissions is also something that is enabled for this particular process. You may be working with a supplier because, again, they do heavily lean on asking your upstream suppliers for information. As mentioned, this is not a testing requirement. They do not require testing. But maybe your supplier is saying this is confidential and doesn't want to share this. So there will be a process for you to start a submission and as the primary submitter, and then have your supplier fill out the remainder of the submission as the secondary supplier. You will not see that confidential information that they may provide. In fact, they may want to make CBI claims on the pieces that they're providing. So that is something that is enabled in this particular rule. I believe we're going to have a poll here before I go on to my last slide.
Hey, Tiffany. I'm sorry, Callie, can I emphasize one of the duplicative
Absolutely.
reporting? So this may be a surprise to some of you, but if you actually manufacture something in the United States, you send it over to another country for it to be installed into another part. And then you bring that same part back into the United States that was originally manufactured in the United States, that still has to be reported as an import. So just be careful with that as well.
Exactly. They seem to be going for as much data as we can get, right?
Right.
So yeah, they're not worried about double reporting. But yes, that's exactly this. The second bullet there on the left was talking about if it had first been imported, but you're absolutely right. You may be assembling it here, sourcing it domestically, the PFAS themselves domestically, shipping it out, and then shipping it back in, and you would absolutely have to report that. So it looks like we have a little more variety on the answers for this particular question than we've had on some of the others. Let's go on to our last slide here. My last slide, I should say. As far as record keeping goes, companies must retain relevant records for a period of 5 years, beginning the last day of the submission period. So not 5 years from when you submitted, but 5 years from the last day of the submission period, which in this case, after the delay last week, is now January 11th of 2026. So you will have to keep those records for 5 years past that point. And this is a fairly standard approach for the EPA. This follows the same requirements that they have for the record keeping. For those of you working in product compliance, 10 years, of course, would be a record keeping rule in the European Union. Say if you're CE marking a product that you're importing to the EU, you're required to keep for 10 years. But in this case, it's 5 years. The EPA has actually acknowledged this little bit of awkwardness between having to go back to 2011 to provide data and the fact that their standard record keeping rule is only 5 years, to the point that in the rule, they even give that as a potential example of when data may not be reasonably ascertainable because it's older than the appropriate record keeping period. That's not free reign to just use that. So please don't take that as what I'm saying. But if you are attempting to get the data from prior to your earliest date on the record keeping timeline, and you can't get it, that may be a consideration. Of course, you'll want to discuss that with your legal counsel to determine if that demonstrates your due diligence or not. But there is this conflict between the 5-year record keeping rule and this look back to 2011. And that's my last slide. So I'm going to hand it off to finish this up here.
Yeah, I will take over now. So next slide.
Next
One
slide.
more. Yep. So I will be talking about risks and liabilities in regards to this PFAS reporting rule. Next slide. So here is a poll. And again, we haven't quite gotten into the presentation, but Penalties include monetary fines only, such as criminal and civil fines, is the question. All right, I think the poll is ending now. So the answer is that that is false. So TSCA non-compliance carries both civil fines and criminal fines, but can also lead to imprisonment for up to 1 year. And civil fines can go up to 37,500 and criminal fines up to 50,000 per day per violation. So this is a big risk, and penalties could be issued for not reporting by the deadline, not maintaining records as required, not allowing inspection at your facility or of your records, not responding to an EPA request for information, and providing false or misleading information. There are other risks that I'll discuss a little throughout my slides as well, specifically in regards to the PFAS reporting rule. The biggest one is probably determining your appropriate level of due diligence, and I will get into that a little bit more in the next slide. Another one is dealing with uncertainty, especially sort of in terms of information that you may or may not have up and down your supply chain. Your decisions on whether you decide to report or not must be defensible. And records that you submit will be available to the public unless you've substantiated your CBI claims. In that case, they will not, but records will be available, for example, through EPA's ChemView site and likely other places as well. And then you should expect that external stakeholders could do a deeper dive into your data and could potentially use that to detract from you and your organization. So next slide. So Tiffany already covered the reporting standard a bit, but it is really important when we're determining due diligence that we are aware of the reporting standard of the rule. It is discussed in the preamble of the rule, and EPA has provided examples. So, but the standard is information known to or reasonably ascertainable by the manufacturer, and this includes all information in a person's possession or control, plus all information that a reasonable person similarly situated might be expected to possess, control, or know. And examples of information include supplier notifications, SDSs, marketing studies, sales reports, customer surveys. They mention any information you may have received at a conference or meeting. And this also includes information that is in possession or control of the site, as well as any subsidiaries and general partnerships and all relevant employees. So it's quite broad. So that will lead us to the due diligence part. So when we talk about what's reasonably ascertainable, this really varies from submitter to submitter. And again, it's also discussed in the rule and in the reporting guidance to the rule. They have good examples of meeting due diligence. So I'll take a look at that. And I think Tiffany covered this as well in some of the questions in the chat, but this is also for sure something you can discuss with your legal team as well. But the first information, the first square here is, yeah, information will vary from case to case, and it could depend on your company's size. So how many people and other resources you can reasonably assign to this reporting task, how many products or records you have to review, what type of record storage system you have. If paper records are in boxes in a warehouse, maybe it's not reasonably accessible. Or do you have an electronic record system? Maybe there are record retention issues in that system that could prevent you from accessing older files. So these are all the things that you have to evaluate in order to determine if the information is reasonably ascertainable. So you'll have to evaluate your current level of knowledge of manufactured and imported PFAS products within your organization. And if you have gaps in knowledge from upstream suppliers, you should be reaching out to suppliers, if reasonable, to confirm presence or absence of PFAS and the chemical identity and concentration. So this is very much part of the reporting standard. I know we've talked about the fact that extensive surveys may not be required. But again, you have to determine what's reasonable for your company. And this may require some legal expertise. But extensive surveys to all of your suppliers and repeated requests for information, if you're not getting a response, is probably not reasonable and would then likely not be required. But it's up to you to assess for your particular organization or company. So the rule does not require submitters to collect information from customers, but it does require that you follow, again, due diligence about what you know about your customers and their uses, because there's reporting on downstream uses as well. You can use reasonable estimates. For example, for environmental releases, maybe there are some calculations you can do to get reasonable estimates of release of the PFAS, which may be part of a mixture. And there are some estimates built into the rule as well. Some things are reported in ranges rather than exact numbers. So you'll see that as you go through. We've already covered that this rule does not have a testing requirement. So I would say if you're a manufacturer and importer and you know or can reasonably ascertain that you manufactured or imported PFAS, then you have to report. But if you conduct your due diligence and you have no known or reasonably ascertainable information to support that you have manufactured or imported PFAS, then you're not covered by this rule and reporting would not be required. But the process of getting there could vary. Next slide, please.
Hey, Christine, if I could just add really quickly, unless you're going to cover this, but just making sure that everyone documents their level of due diligence.
Yeah.
You sent out a survey request, if you decided to do that, but you didn't get a response, document that. In the event that EPA does audit you, you'll be able to show them proof of your due diligence.
Absolutely. Yep. I will cover that in my next slide. But that's a very good point. So some risks with CBI claims, you have to prepare substantiation for all of your confidential business information claims if the claims are not exempt, and the rule spells out which ones are exempt from substantiation. You could consider getting your legal team involved to prepare a robust substantiation for these data elements. As I mentioned, the data that is not claimed confidential will be available to the public. If you report a substance using an accession number, the accession number itself cannot be claimed confidential. But the underlying chemical identity can, and you should make sure to always claim that as confidential, because if you do not, even if you don't know the identity, you just have the accession number from your supplier. But if you do not claim that as confidential, the chemical identity as confidential, then EPA will assume that the confidentiality claim has been waived and will publish the chemical identity in the inventory, even if it's not your, even if you don't know the identity. If the PFAS information is obtained under an NDA, you have to work with whoever you have the NDA with to ensure that releasing this information to EPA does not violate the NDA. And in that case, you could do a joint submission. Joint reporting is useful if the supplier is unwilling to disclose the PFAS identity, and EPA does not expect to hold the primary submitter responsible if the secondary submitter or your supplier fails to submit their part of the report. As already mentioned, if you're using the streamlined form for articles, then the joint submission is not an option, and then you would use the not known or reasonably ascertainable for the unknown data elements, and just make sure you include as much information as possible to be able to describe the chemical. Next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide. So this is really how to mitigate risks and liabilities. So the first step, as I mentioned, is understanding where in your supply chain PFAS are imported and manufactured, and in doing so, reaching out to suppliers to determine which PFAS you're importing and manufacturing, and then recording all of those efforts to procure information from your suppliers or even other external sources. If you're looking up online on their website or SDS's, document all of your efforts. And if you make a decision not to report, document why you're not reporting. Understand how PFAS are handled on site. So how you need to report on exposure and disposal. So you should understand that. And also how PFAS are used downstream by your customers. Determine how PFAS records are stored at your site, and determine the feasibility of retrieving those records. So that's part of your due diligence. If you cannot retrieve those records, document why. Involve your legal team to discuss these risks and liabilities within your organization, and prepare a company policy. This is best practice, I would say, on the process of which you're gathering information, on your due diligence decisions, and how you handle uncertainty when you don't have a response from a supplier and you have no way of finding out something. And then communicate this policy throughout your company with the teams you're working with to prepare the reporting. You should ensure that your reporting efforts and decisions are transparent and consistent. And again, document your decisions. And then this is a good point. You should store PFAS records in the same format as you're reporting them in. So if you have production volumes that you're grabbing out of your system, make sure to save that file with it, so you don't have to go and grab them out of the system again in 4 years or 5 years when you're inspected. Have it all ready the way you reported it, so that there's consistency. And then communicate with all impacted stakeholders in your supply chain and in your company. And if you have questions, you can contact the TSCA hotline or EPA contacts listed in the docket. They do also have an FAQ document and a reporting guidance document that's very helpful. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'd like to thank all of our knowledgeable panelists for volunteering today to speak on this matter. And also, I'd like to thank the participants for the very engaging chat that we've had during the discussion. It looks like we have just a couple of moments left before we end the webinar. So as I scan through some of the questions, I think that there's a question from 1121 over in the chat on the right from Steve George. If a product is exported into the U.S., can you confirm the obligation on the importer? Do we have one of the panelists that could take that question?
So yes, the regulation is applicable to imports into the United States. So if you're in the UK and you're sending something over to the US, the entity in the US must report, and it also applies to manufacturing of PFAS in the United States.
I would definitely refer to whoever is the importer of record, who is importing it into the U.S. territory. So sometimes a foreign company will have a domestic legal entity here in the U.S. that they import under. Sometimes they may use a third party. If they're using that third party or a distributor, they would have that obligation. They may still need the data from you, however, to do the reporting, but it comes down to who is the legal entity as the importer of record.
Thanks for that clarification, Callie. That's important.
And thank you both, ladies, for addressing that question. And then why don't we look to take one more question? I know that we'll go through the questions before, afterwards, but we had a question that came in that was anonymous. So do you know if you can do both the streamlined article reporting for some sites and a standard reporting for others? I assume this is from this site. We will just import articles containing PFAS for at least half of our operations.
Yes, for articles, you can decide if you want to use the streamlined reporting form or the full reporting form, depending on how much information you have on the PFAS contained in the article. And
I think they're asking as well, can you do the streamlined reporting as well as the full report from the same site?
yes, not on a different not on the same PFAS chemical at the same site, but in different sites. Yes, you can decide if you want at the same site for different chemicals. You can decide if you are going to do the streamline or the full reporting form, and also across sites. You don't have to be consistent. It really depends on the amount of information you have and what makes most sense to use.
Thank you, Christine and Lisa. So those are the two that I saw through the vast chat that I don't think we provided any answers to. I guess I'll just, with a moment or two left, I'll just ask the audience, is there anyone on the call that feels that their question did not get answered during the chat or in the discussion here? All right, well, thank you so much for your participation and engagement. Again, we were happy to speak with you today. And just as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and posted on the IAG channel. So thank you again to our knowledgeable panelists and everyone who participated today. We appreciate you joining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.